like you guys can see. Okay. So let's just begin with the session. Let's not delay any further. Argumentations and extensions. So, okay, firstly, is credits for the session. I think I've taken inferences from Luigi Alcanis's workshop and Heather Goldberg's workshop and Anna Cohen's workshop on how argumentations are supposed to be made and how exactly mechanisms to set argumentations, how examples are likely to be made at all points of time. But also, thank you, Alitia, for the design inspo. Thank you, Chronicle Lapsop, for I use their basic material as well as to how they teach their kiddos. And thank you, Ishwar, Kiran, Shujyoti, of course, for being a part of this meet. That being said, quickly moving on to okay, the agenda of this workshop will consider four things. Firstly, will be basics of argumentation and extensions. Second, will be persuasiveness and how you're likely supposed to be persuasive within BP setups. Thirdly, would be advanced argumentation and how you're likely supposed to be going with advanced argumentation, creating it, explaining it to a judge. And lastly, will be conclusions for the entire session. That being said, what is the basics then? In the basics, I think the previous session concluded in what you're supposed to do as a speaker, what role burdens do you have, and what exactly motion burdens and all of that you likely go ahead and have. I think Mundra covered all of them. What are extensions then? An extension is a new or distinct contribution or what builds on the motion but goes beyond the opening to begin with. And note this, extensions are not likely just opening focused or something. Extensions are simply what newer perspectives, newer material that you're likely going ahead and providing. What do I mean by this? It means that if you're PM and you're setting up the debate, your DPM and your DLO, that is your Deputy Prime Minister and your Deputy Leader of Opposition, also have a role burden on them to go ahead and provide a distinct extension to your PM and DPM, so to your PM, to ensure you can go ahead and prioritize, like you can go ahead and extend on the material that your PM has given, etc. Which means it's not just limited to closing speeches, but also limited to opening speeches as well. What are the types of extensions? The types probably will be new stakeholders or new perspectives. I hope you know what stakeholders are, but even if you don't, stakeholders are people within debates who are getting affected by what actions the actors are likely going to take. Which means if there's a motion like this house would ban smoking or something, in that regard, the state is taking an action to ban smoking, likely, which means the stakeholders of this would probably be individuals who are smoking, would be probably families of the said individuals, can be extended to industries of the entire smoking industry and the people it hires, etc. So all of this are stakeholders, and all of these are different perspectives that we can talk about within the motion. And note this, the amount of perspectives that you talk about ensures how diverse your cases and how expanded your cases. But again, do not talk about perspectives which directly do not link back to the motion or directly do not get affected by the sort of stakeholders to begin with, unless you can logically explain how these stakeholders are getting affected at all points of time. Otherwise, it'll be unpersuasive. I'm going to come to that a bit later. But secondly, newer mechanisms or policies are also extensions, which means if you talk about policy motions that probably the opening has probably asserted, like just take the example of this particular motion of this also ban smoking. Opening government has just given an entire case about why smoking is something which should be banned. Perfectly fine. But they have not given the mechanism as to how the policy should be implemented in the banning process or something. CJ can just come and give an extension about the newer mechanisms that can lead up to this policy or how exactly the impacts of the OJ that they want to go ahead and bring, the urgency metric that OJ establishes as to why smoking needs to be banned, gets fulfilled in closing government's speech because they go ahead and explain to you how this ban will likely take place, how this will affect industries, people, etc., and then how it will probably create this sort of benefits for individuals to begin with. But lastly, it can also be a new impact layer, which means if opening has talked about the fact that in this sort of like bannings is supposed to be morally bad because you're likely going to go ahead and affect your family's health, you're affecting your family's economics, etc. You're affecting all of these sort of conversations. Then you, as closing, can just extend on that impact by stating how, without the ban of smoking, you probably are creating problems in educational institutions, the peer pressure that gets created due to smoking, and how you're then affecting the youth of a nation, and that affect like affecting the youth of a nation would likely mean that the future of the nation is probably harmed in the long term, especially with the growing population or aging population that most nations likely have. If they smoke more, there's a greater capacity for them to like have lung cancer and have diseases when they turn 40 or something, which would probably be far more harmful for their families and even the growth of a nation and the tangible output the nation can have. Which is a newer impact layer that you're adding to opening government's impact on morality and moral scruples. As long as that exists, note this, extensions are not repeating openings argumentations with illustrations or examples. Which means if your PM as well has run the argument of morality, you are talking about in like with that, oh, imagine Mukesh that you go ahead and see in movie theaters and imagine yourself in the standpoint of Mukesh probably. How exactly like a person probably is dying at all points of time and their like mothers and sisters are probably suffering because of this. They are the only earning member of the family and they're dying. That is an illustration to how that argument might likely manifest, but that illustration is likely not an extension. It's just rehashing on the same premise that the opening said or like the PM said in the round, and you're just trying to illustrate how that likely happens. That is not a tangible explanation or extension because it does not have any extended logic to that. But also, they are not just rebuttals. They are also not just rebuttals. Extensions can't be rebuttals unless you explain how you solve the harms that you got and push. Which means if opening runs case A and you are just trying to rebut opposition using the material that opening is provided in case A, it's far more harder for a judge to go ahead and weigh the closing over the opening at all points of time, unless closing uniquely explains how they go ahead and solve the problems that like they go ahead and identify in the harms that they push on opposition side of the paradigm. As long as that explanation exists, closing can still uniquely explain extra harms and extra benefits than their closing explains. If they can't do that, there is a lesser likelihood of the extension of closing being credited over their opening or probably weighed over their opening at all points of time. Any questions up until now? Okay. If you have any questions, you can raise your hand, unmute, or just ask in the chat. No issues. That being said, moving on to the next slide. What are arguments then? What is an argument? An argument is the idea or contentions that you have with an emotion. What you intend to go ahead and prove with the stance that you go ahead and have. What does that mean? It means that if you go ahead and have the debate about how this house would go ahead and ban smoking or something, the argument would likely mean why is smoking bad to begin with? What harms does smoking go ahead and cause? What are the number of perspectives that we can go ahead and talk about within this motion? All of these ideas and contentions are is an argument. Secondly, what you likely go ahead and intend to prove, which means if you're intending to prove that smoking should be banned because people get affected by it, then that is a stance that you have within the round, and that is a mechanism that you likely go ahead and prove why smoking should be banned to begin with, and that is what becomes an argument. What is the structure of cases usually then, and how does that look like? The structure of cases has threefold. Number one, it goes ahead and has a setup of the case, which means context about the world and characterizations. Which means if you are going ahead and defining probably a world as to how people in this world are likely smoking more, how education institutions is peer pressure due to people, and that leads to more people opting into smoking. But there is probably a status quo where a lot of youth is probably engaging in smoking, etc. Even regardless of the taxation that the government is putting on smoking, people are still opting into smoking because they're addicted towards it. It's an addiction problem as well. All of these conversations are the problems in the world that can go ahead and exist and the characterizations that you go ahead and do about what the world likely goes ahead and looks like. Note, this is the setup, which means this setup is likely agreed by both sides within the debate. You cannot go ahead and say in setup that, okay, every person who goes ahead and smokes probably dies off in the near future. That is something which is A, uncharitable in setup, but secondly, you have to logically prove how that likely happens. You have to frame out how that likely happens on the vast majority of instances without just asserting that within the case. The only assertions that you can make within debate setups is one that will get accepted by either side of the world, which means you can go ahead and make this assertion that education institutions has peer pressure, which people go ahead and opt into to go ahead and smoke. I don't think opposition can go ahead and prove that peer pressure does not exist. Neither can opposition prove the fact that you probably have you probably don't have a smoking problem, you probably don't have any health issues from smoking or something. I think opposition will still agree and trade that off for greater benefits of the opposition's case to begin with. But secondly, The second part of your case would likely mean what the problems in this world likely go ahead and look like, which means what problems does this world have and what you intend to solve within your debate. No two things are very important in BP debates. Number one, the clarity of your pushes. What is your push? How you're manifesting that push? How exactly do you have certain impacts of that push is very important for the push to go ahead and stand at all points of time and be weighed out by a judge. If you're not clear about your pushes, if you're not clear about what problems you're uniquely solving, why is it important to solve those problems, how exactly do you solve those problems with the mechanisms that you have, there is a lesser likelihood for you to win the round because the judge will literally be confused based on the fact that there are literally four teams in the round giving like two speeches of content each. If you're not clear, it's far more harder for the judge to understand what exactly you're solving and what exactly you're going at and doing or contributing within the entire conversation of the round. So it's important for you to be clear within BP speeches. But lastly, would be the arguments as to how you prove to go ahead and solve these problems, which means the arguments as to how the state would likely go ahead and implement certain mechanisms to go ahead and ban smoking, how this implementation of the ban would look like, how probably the local tapris around like schools and colleges will be closed down, how exactly there will be an the supply chains of tobacco will probably be banned outright. It will probably be immensely illegal to go ahead and sell any sort of tobacco. It will make it in, and you probably will be having greater amount of tax, even greater than the one that exists now, on the sort of consumption of these goods to ensure that it becomes unaffordable for people to ever go ahead and engage in smoking, which means a financial ban will likely be established. Note a very important thing: arguments are not assertions, which means that just saying that we support X as this harm Y is happening won't be credited fully unless you explain what exact harm Y faces and how then is X implemented and how exactly does the benefits go ahead and manifest. Which means if which means in this context, if X is a harm that is smoking, and you just go ahead and say, oh, people smoke, and that's why we are going to ban from that's why the government wants to go ahead and ban. The problem is you'll be unpersuasive to an extent within the round unless you explain the exact harms of what smoking goes ahead and creates, the extent of harm that smoking goes ahead and creates, the vulnerability of the people who engage in smoking and their family members, etc. But secondly, what argument you would likely go ahead and have, or the why, or the solution that you go ahead and have to the harms that can go ahead and exist, how those solutions manifest, how exactly these arguments can go ahead and benefit people to begin with. Arguments are also not examples, which means they are logic that you say and explain to a judge to further your stance to begin with. Arguments can never be examples like saying that, oh, like okay, India probably has extended taxes and that is somehow constituting to like banning it probably for poorer individuals who can't even afford these sort of conversations. The problem is you still need to tangibly explain how the mechanism likely manifests, not just giving examples of the same, because examples won't make arguments, because examples, unless you prove that example applies to every single instance, which means unless you prove that the Indian system probably applies to the European system of ban as well, UK system of ban as well, probably a US system of ban as well, that example will be unpersuasive. You can show an example to illustrate how something manifests, but you still need to give the logic behind how these sort of conversations can go ahead and manifest. What is the example? Again, I've talked about how the this house believe that should ban smoking can go ahead and exist, but let's give an example of what extensions can likely go ahead and look like in this. Opening government, suppose assuming that OG runs a case on harms of smoking and why it should be banned. Opening opposition's case then runs on the principles of personal freedom and how the state is encroaching on the same. How exactly people probably have the personal freedom to choose whether they want to go ahead and engage in smoking. And if the state is trying to ban it, like they are encroaching on their freedom of choice and autonomy for a person to do so. What will likely be the CG extension then? It can be twofold. Number one, how the ban should be implemented for maximum effectiveness, which means as long as OG has not talked about how the ban will be implemented, but only talked about why the ban is necessary, USCG can just go ahead and extend on the fact that how this ban would be likely implemented for maximum effectiveness. Or secondly, just proving why states are the best actor to do so. Why state probably will be the best actor to control these monopolies of monopolies that probably Manchester and these other like Marlboro companies have created on the cigarette market, and why exactly the state is the best actor to go ahead and cater to this monopolization and ensure that they do not carry the capacity to sell sell these sort of condiments. But also, what are closing opposition's extension then? Closing opposition then can extend on opening opposition stance of personal freedom and can introduce an entirely new perspective within the round by stating number one, how the economics of the ban go ahead and happen and how it affects industries to begin with. They can go ahead and say that how many people will likely go ahead and be laid off, how exactly these poverty stricken individuals who like run thekas, etc., likely the most vulnerable individuals right now, because these individuals are probably belonging from slums, they do not have a good quality of life, etc. And the state will directly harm these individuals by not giving them a source of livelihood, by banning cigarettes and the amount of billions of dollars worth of losses that the government will do onto the entire cigarette industry that probably employs thousands of people within this sort of countries to begin with. But secondly, how state is directly responsible for the harms that led to the engagement in smoking and how it's a necessary evil. What does this mean? It means that most people likely go ahead and engage in smoking, especially like middle class people, they are not able to quit smoking, not just because of the addictions that they have, but also because their life and the way that they live their life is probably so painful in nature, it's probably so atrocious in nature, which means you will probably always live a boring 9 to 5 job and you are very stressed in your life, etc. And smoking is an escape mechanism that you choose because there is no better escape mechanism that the state can provide you. There is no better job that the state is providing you. You're living a stressful life under the capitalistic regime, which is why the state is directly likely responsible for the harms of you engaging in smoking because it's responsible for the harms that is enabling you a pathway to smoking to begin with, and how exactly you probably need smoking to exist so that people have a necessary evil to go ahead and like probably smoke to begin with. And if they do not have like cigarettes or something, they're likely to engage in alcoholism or other worse escape mechanisms, which would likely create far worse problems in the short term and in the long term as well, considering smoking probably only manifests as a harm in the long term. You can use arguments then to go ahead and justify the claims and explain why an argument is more important than the other. When I explain to you how these economics manifest, how normal people go ahead and react to this sort of ban, how exactly industries and a lot of people will likely get laid off, all of these are arguments and perspectives that I'm talking about within the round. I give mechanisms as to how this likely is true or false or etc. And that is where my extensions probably get importance within the round. That is where my extensions probably and my arguments probably get validated within the round. Let's talk about persuasiveness within the round. But before that, any questions? Okay. Assuming no questions, let's talk about then persuasiveness. What does persuasiveness entail, or how to be persuasive to an like ordinary intelligent voter? Firstly, what is an ordinary intelligent voter? An ordinary intelligent voter on OIV is what your judge is supposed to be in an ideal circumstance of when they're judging. Which means when you're likely judging, like when you're judging a debate, a judge is ideally supposed to be a person who is having the knowledge about global facts and news, etc., who probably knows basic facts that okay, smoking is harmful. He does not know the specifics about how many people probably die from smoking. He does not know the specifics about how many individuals likely go ahead and how many families or how much money a family spends on trying to cure lung cancer, etc. How much does the healthcare industry or the smoking industry earn at all points of time due to the harms or benefits of smoking, vice versa, or what like policies the state specifically has against smoking instead. I don't think the YB knows specifics, but the YB still knows basic facts about how smoking is likely bad, about how the status quo likely goes ahead and looks like on the world to begin with. So, how are you persuasive to an average intelligent voter or a judge? The analysis behind an argument makes it more persuasive and it consists of the reasons offered in support of the argument, which means that reasons can like the reasons that you provide to go ahead and prove why an argument is probably good, bad, or why an argument manifests, how an argument is likely true, etc. If that is the way that you are persuasive within BP debates, the more number of reasons you give, the more number of ability, the more reasons you give makes your argument far more persuasive. But secondly, the more explanations you give behind those reasons as to why those arguments are beneficial and manifesting in a good way is the way that you probably have better persuasiveness within the debate. What are these reasons then? These reasons might go ahead and explain why arguments are likely true by either presenting empirical evidence for the argument, which means you're trying to go ahead and explain why empirically it's true that people who go ahead and engage probably in smoking probably face greater health worsening outcomes than an average individual who does not go ahead and smoke. That is an empirical evidence as well, just by stating that like regardless of lung cancer or something happening, you probably have like breathing problems, you probably have gastrointestinal diseases, whatnot from smoking to begin with. So all of these are reasons that are empirical evidences to support why an argument is true. But secondly, giving mechanistic linkages as to why a certain outcome will come about. The same mechanism that I gave earlier as to how an argument is likely to go ahead and manifest, why an argument is likely to go ahead and manifest in the way that you're stating. Which means if you like give a ban onto like smoking and increase its prices, why would that be effective? Because people in most developing and underdeveloped nations who are the biggest consumers of cigarettes will likely go ahead and not have the money to afford cigarettes at all points of time. And as long as that exists, there is a greater mechanism as to why a certain argument would come about and why a certain outcome would likely go ahead and come about. And thirdly, then, or why the mechanism about like taxation is effective. But thirdly, then, identifying widely shared moral intuitions in favor of an argument, which means if there is an existent moral intuition that you should probably not create suffering for your family. You should probably not go ahead and die at all points of time because dying is bad. That is morally agreed upon by the entire world. You can just use that and identify that moral intuition and saying how smoking makes you more proximate to death, and that is why it's morally wrong for you to go ahead and smoke because it's an acceptable moral intuition. You don't need to expand on this like further explaining as to why dying is bad or something because it's already accepted in the world that dying is something which is already like likely bad unless you go ahead and manage to prove otherwise or something. So the thing is, as long as that intuition exists, you can just go ahead and use that in the favor of an argument. But fourthly, you can probably also expose a damaging logical implication of a contrasting argument, which means that if opposition tries to run the fact that oh dying is probably better because this world is pain and it's bad, etc., then the damaging implication of that argument is a slippery slope, which means that you are likely justifying a person killing themselves slowly or like regularly just because the world is pain to begin with, and that implication means that like the state should likely just allow them to do that. That is where I think you as a gov bench can just go ahead and manage the outcome or give the logic that you should probably as a state not allow people to kill themselves by smoking slowly over time. You should probably allow them to go ahead and have better lives, create better lifestyle for them at all points of time, and try to not give them the outlet of killing themselves or not. And lastly, the identifying an emotive response that encourages to care about a certain outcome. What this means is simple. It means that you probably are like catering to like and catering to the emotions of a judge, which likely means that if you see that there is a motion about feminism, etc., and you're probably debating on the fact that oh, women are probably so oppressed in the status quo, they are probably facing so much harms about arranged marriages, etc., you can still like identify an emotive response, which means you can still go ahead and tell that oh, this sort of policy probably needs to be implemented because there are women and children who are dying every day, who are probably being sold off to dowry every day, who are probably being abused, domestically abused, raped every day, or in marriages and arranged marriages, and that is likely why a policy to go ahead and cater to them needs to be established at all points of time. This is probably not very logical per se, like ideally, but people know that it's like happening in the current status quo because they know that domestic violence happens in the current status quo. They still know that it's emotionally bad for women to go ahead and engage in this sort of scenario. So you would likely care about the outcome of protecting women at all points of time because of this harm that is tangibly happening to women that establishes their vulnerability. Reasons themselves may be stronger or weaker according to a number of important criteria, which means the precision of what the speaker says, which means if somebody vaguely goes ahead and tells you that, oh, women are suffering harms of arranged marriages in the current status quo, and they just move on from that, they don't illustrate that. A speaker who goes ahead and illustrates what the harm is, what exactly the domestic violence is, how exactly marital like rape and all of these problems go ahead and happen, they will be more persuasive than what the precision, like what the speaker who was likely vague and just like rehashed or just moved on from that argument would likely be. But secondly, the detail with which relevant logical claims, empirical evidences, causal processes, intuitions are explained, which means if you're likely going ahead and explaining that death is considered to be bad in the current status quo because it takes away the an individual's ability to live life and the pleasures that life has to offer. But second, it also takes away the ability for an individual to go ahead and sustain their family, takes away the ability for an individual to go ahead and contribute to the economy, and that is likely why a state is supposed to care about it because all the laws and the laws of the land of the CJS likely go ahead and prioritize a person's ability to live life to the fullest. All humanitarian laws go ahead and support that, which means if the state does not go ahead and take action into preventing a person from like dying at all points of time, there is a greater ability for the state to be like nihilistic in nature, and it's inherently bad for the state to be that. That is like a precise detail through which I'm explaining how an argument manifests and why exactly the logic behind that argument goes out and manifests. I'm using empirical evidences as to how the CJ systems are shaped. I'm using the moral intuition of death being bad and why are you likely supposed to care about your family, etc. Or even like logical implications of what it means for the economy of a state to go ahead and justify why death is bad and why exactly a state should go ahead and prevent that sort of death at all points of time. So I think all of this directly means the more detail I induce within these sort of cases, the more importance and persuasive I am to an average individual or an average judge at all points of time. Any questions up until now?
What do you mean by the empirical evidence?
Okay, empirical evidences are something which is like true on every scale possible, which means that if you go ahead and run the fact that majority of people who go ahead and smoke probably have diseases that happen to them later in the future, they probably have harms to their body that they're causing, that is an empirical truth. Because you can't go ahead and say that like majority of people do not have any sort of medical issues that is happening to them. You can trade off that harm. You can say that okay, the pain that people go ahead and experience probably outweighs the amount of pain that they'll face on the majority scale about how the medical issues that they go ahead and face. You can trade that off, but you can't go ahead and say that people do not experience these sort of problems or medical or health issues in the near future. They don't express shortlessness or whatnot. Yeah, or like the sun rises in the east. It's also an empirical truth.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so what is the argument structure and what are extension structures within BP debating? The argument structure, firstly, is like fourfold, and this is like a complex argument structure because I'm gonna like enable you to have the maximum amount of benefit coming out of your argument. I'm not gonna explain you assertion, reasoning, argumentation, or something. So, what is the argument structure likely supposed to look like in BPA? Firstly, the premise of that argument, which is where is that argument set up or how it gets proven in the end, which means that like if you're running an argument by stating that like okay, so if you're running an argument that smoking is bad, the premise of that argument will likely mean that smoking creates far more health problems for individuals, and that is smoking creates far more health problems for individuals and more deaths on average, and that is why it's bad because we need to prioritize the living. Then comes the mechanism of that argument, how that argument likely works. You can then go ahead and say how smoking likely puts a huge amount of pressure onto your lungs and onto your bodily systems to cater to the smoke. You're inhaling lead and all of these harmful chemicals, and that is why you probably have so much amount of harms onto your body at all points of time. How then smoking structurally goes ahead and harms your lungs to the point that you're probably having tumors or cancers in your lungs if you perpetually smoke for a longer period of time. But secondly, because of this sort of cancer or like all of these problems, you likely go to the hospitals more, which means your family spends more in the hospital, which means the entire idea of your family having lesser income to go ahead and probably send another child to school or something is probably lesser. Or especially if you're a middle class individual, the financial pressure in your family is far more because you go ahead and smoke as a direct impact in the near future. But there can be also a mechanism as to how, because you're smoking and because peer pressure is happening, more people go ahead and opt into smoke. And that first mechanism that I talked about earlier as to how the economy is probably getting affected because most people are probably in hospitals or just suffering from bad health. And health is something the state should prioritize because, again, you probably want your working class populace to be very healthy to ensure that they can contribute meaningfully to the economy. You don't want them to die at all points of time. So I think all of these are mechanisms to go ahead and prove the premise of an argument or prove the fact that like how like mechanisms to go ahead and show how exactly this argument manifests, why exactly is it bad, how exactly is the harm that is you're talking about or the benefit you're talking about manifesting. Then comes impacting. How does it affect the given stakeholders and actors? Which means how does the proper mechanism as to health issues go ahead and affect the given stakeholders and actors? How exactly does it go ahead and harm the demographics of the populace? How exactly is the youth affected? How exactly is the poor people affected? How exactly are minorities affected? Or like because again, if you're a minority or and if you're poverty stricken, etc., there's a greater capacity for you to be affected even more by somebody smoking in your family because of the health issue that they're going to face later on. They likely will have to go to government hospitals, and government hospitals do not have the ability to treat so many people at once or give them good quality treatment, which means that the likelihood of their death is far more, which is far more harmful because there is probably a single person earning for the entire family in this sort of like lower income households, etc., which means the minorities are disproportionately affected by somebody dying in their family, and that death is directly by proximate due to the person smoking at all points of time. That is what the impacting likely goes that it looks like in that sort of conversation. Then, what is weighing and importance? Weighing is why is the impact of trying to prioritize these sort of prioritize these minority populace, prioritize these vulnerable people, probably more important as compared to other teams. Which means if opening opposition is trying to run an argument on personal freedom, you can just use the analysis that if your personal freedom leads to a person killing themselves in the long term or leads to a person poisoning themselves in the long term, that personal freedom can never be viable. Or you can run an argument from CG or a weighing mechanism from CG as to how exactly, if opening opposition runs the argument of personal freedom, how exactly your personal freedom does not allow you to harm other people based on the public smoking that they can go ahead and do, and how exactly people existing within these spaces also inhale in the smoke and their health also gets harmed due to passive smoking, and how exactly your personal freedom cannot outweigh somebody else's autonomy and ability to experience clean air and hygiene, which means that the other person getting affected due to this is probably the more important impact to be considered compared to the person who is smoking and the freedom of them doing so. So that is where weighing likely goes at and comes. Why? And secondly, on importance, you can just go ahead and say how a vulnerable person is probably more important than an elite individual who can go ahead and experience the privileges of life, or who can smoke and still trade off the harm of economic harm of smoking because they are rich enough to go ahead and pay for the medical treatment, etc. And that is where you're weighing the vulnerable lower income households over the higher income households at all points of time. What is the extension structure then? The extension structure is probably just taking the perspective of CG then. The extension from CG would likely mean that what has OG proven within the round? Secondly, what is the core contention in the opening half? What is the opening half talked about? How exactly did what the opening half talked about? Something which is less relevant to the round as compared to what the closing half will likely go ahead and talk about, or what the CG will likely go ahead and talk about, and what would CG go ahead and prove under novelty. What does this mean? It means if OG has talked about in a round that why smoking is bad, CGS pointed that out that OG has talked about why smoking is bad. Then you're having the core contention on opening half that where OG proves why smoking is bad. Sorry, opening opposition proves why smoking is necessary for people. You from CG will prove how the ban is probably implemented and why exactly the effectiveness of this ban is likely more important than either world, because OG never has a way to go ahead and accrue better impacts or benefits on their world. Opening opposition does not have a way to outweigh the harms of smoking at all points of time. CG will use the mechanism of benefits to go ahead and provide a case about how the policy of banning probably happens, and then weigh over their opening opposition as to how the benefits that they provide under this ban outweighs the personal freedom that opening opposition talks about in principle. That is what extensions likely going to look like, and the way you should structure the extension. What conversation has happened, what is new that you go ahead and provide, and what that does for you within the round. We'll move on to advanced argumentation, but before that, any questions up until now? I hope it's absolutely clear. Also, if you have any questions regarding burden fulfillment, etc., I'm going to take that up in the end of my session, which means what you're supposed to do from CG or CO. I think I've already explained, and I think the previous session covered that. But if you need any more questions onto that, we will take it at the end of the session. Cool. Moving on to advanced argumentation then. Okay. What does wait a sec. Okay. Just a sec. I think there's a slide missing in this. Wait a sec. Just a sec. If anybody has any questions about it, I'll just put them in the chat space. Okay. Yep. Continuing on with the session, then the first part of advanced argumentation and how you're likely supposed to go ahead and give advanced argumentation would be multi-layered argumentation. What does this mean? It means that when you're giving a multi-layered argumentation, you're giving either multiple mechanisms to go ahead and prove a particular argument, or you're giving multiple abilities of likelihood or relevance of outcomes or contextualization and importance of the said argument. What do I mean by this? It's simple. If you're trying to prove an argument, there is a greater burden onto a person or onto the person proving that sort of argument to prove the likelihood of the same. Which means if you're trying to prove in a sort of hypothetical scenario as to why smoking is something which is bad, then you need to prove on likelihood why it gets better on your world. That proof of likelihood is something that you then go ahead and give underlying the mechanisms as to the policy of how the ban happens and why exactly that on likelihood you probably have lesser people engaging in smoking, and that is why the benefits of like lesser people engaging in smoking is manifest at all points of time. Healthier populace, more contribution to economy, lesser ability for people to be vulnerable and their families to be vulnerable to medical and health insurances, whatnot. Or secondly, what is the relevance of outcomes, which means the impact that you're trying to derive from these sort of conversations. What is the relevance of these sort of impacts that you're deriving? Which means why is it important for a vulnerable actor to go ahead and prioritize something, or why is it important for you to prioritize a vulnerable actor? Like I explained earlier, that sort of weighing mechanisms you need to give in your argument. But lastly, the contextualization and importance, which means under what context does your argument go ahead and become far more better? Which means if you run in a debate about like banning smoking again, if you run the argument about developed nations, that would probably be less contextually important than a developing and underdeveloped nations with weak regulations, weak healthcare like India, etc., where smoking is probably creating far more harms on average than the developed nations to begin with. That is why context setting your argument is also very important. Note, you might be limiting the extent of the argument inherently, but secondly, but this is to an extent good if you manage to go ahead and show why developed and underdeveloped nation needs to be prioritized within this debate, and secondly, why that contextualization and prioritization is something which is important within the round. There are four ways to have multi-layered arguments. Number one, breadth of the argument. How many ways can we go ahead and reach the same thing? Which means the amount of mechanisms you can go ahead and give to justify one particular argument. Like, for example, the perspective of family being harmed, the perspective of the individual being harmed on health basis, the perspective of economy being harmed on the health basis, all justify the same outcome as to how exactly smoking is empirically bad and should not be done at all points of time. These expand the breadth of the argument and gives a multi-layered mechanism to prove an argument at all points of time. But secondly, there is also a depth of the argument. What linkages exist between arguments and what are the in-between steps you need to take to get to the next point? Which means that if you're running first an argument as to why smoking is bad, then secondarily you're running an argument as to how it probably weighs over. Like then you're running an argument as to why the principle of personal freedom cannot weigh over the principle of life. You already have proven how the principle of life is getting affected in like the previous argument that you talked about, which means the depth of that argument is better, which means you can engage in the secondary argument with a greater depth. You can engage in the linkages with a greater depth as to saying that, now principle of personal freedom can never be outweighed by the ability for you to live life, because you probably need to live to exercise the autonomy that the state goes ahead and gives you. But secondly, why exactly the state is less likely to go ahead and provide you an avenue to kill yourself, especially when you realize that over time the poisoning that you go ahead and do to yourself is like probably not a good thing, because you're likely living in a society, you're interacting with your family, you have a responsibility towards your family, you have a responsibility as a citizen towards your state, you have to fulfill all of the responsibilities, you can't just escape those responsibilities, and the avenue of death is the easiest way to escape that. And that is why you should not go ahead and engage with this sort of conversation, and the state should prevent your that access to that avenue of personal freedom, whatever you go ahead and talk about. And that is where this is the in between steps that you need to go ahead and do before you take to the next point. Which means if like you're proving firstly as to how the life or people are probably getting affected on vulnerability scopes, then you can still go ahead and extend on that sort of analysis with the secondary argument that you run as to why exactly people should not be allowed to go ahead and engage in bad escape mechanisms. And this bad escape mechanisms is something that the state should go ahead and prevent at all points of time. That is a secondary argument you can run, which increases the depth of your case. But lastly, on breakdown, then, what is the tipping point of the debate and the necessary conditions to meet the threshold of belief? Which means how the strategy is the most valid pathway to prove an argument. What does this mean? It means that if you're trying to go ahead and prove that, okay, a mechanism like economics is something which is a valid pathway to go ahead and prove why individuals should and why smoking is something which is bad, it is a less likelihood for like the judge to go ahead and buy that a state will likely care about economics in the first instance, that they go ahead and understand why smoking is likely to be bad. Instead of that, you can create like this sort of linkages where you first go ahead and talk about how health is something which is important for a state to be prioritized, how the human rights literally go ahead and try to prioritize the ability for a person to live life to the fullest, and how exactly smoking probably prevents your ability to do that, how exactly you go into hospitals, you probably spend a significant amount of time in hospitals, how the amount of money that you're spending within these hospitals, the state has a direct responsibility to ensure that this money is probably lesser spent and the vulnerable families probably get taken care of even more at all points of time. Then you go ahead and prove economy, and then you go ahead and say why the state is then likely to care about the economy because of all this harm that the state already cares about. You break down the case into these sort of segments, and then you explain why this sort of importance goes ahead and manifests. And lastly, the impacting, which means what does this argument about smoking being bad do further out? You can then go ahead and say that this argument of smoking being bad probably weighs over opening opposition's argument on personal freedoms. It also probably weighs over the persuasive natures of opening government, because OG likely just assume that smoking is bad and moves on with their case just to proving that, okay, smoking is bad, so we're just likely going to ban it. You still go ahead and use the analysis that you provide and tell the judge as to why you go ahead and prove smoking being bad is something which is exclusively proven in CG. And as long as that urgency metric exists, you probably then solve the problem better based on another argument that you can go ahead and run as to how you implement the ban better, how exactly you raise taxations, how exactly you made things unaffordable, how exactly you probably ban like tapris, etc. near education institutions, and you probably go ahead and have better impacting on your world. Which means the case that you have or the argument that you have, what does that do for the entire room or the entire round is something that you go ahead and prioritize at all points of time. Can you explain to the judge what that does? Cool. That being said, let's take an example. Let's move beyond the smoking and all of that, because I think it's been a very trivializing example. Let's take a claim. The claim of or the argument specifically is that a carbon tax would reduce the amount of carbon dioxide released into the environment. Okay, this is an intuitive claim. They claim that, okay, if you impose a tax onto something, the people will less likely engage with this sort of scenario. True. What is the premise of this argument? Note, this is the exact way you're likely supposed to prove an argument. The structure of an argument, which I explained earlier about how the premise is done, how the mechanisms is done, impacting is done, is the exact way you're supposed to go about an argument. The premise of this argument would become that carbon tax would make it uneconomical for consumers and corporates to produce carbon heavy or emission heavy goods. Perfectly fine, it's intuitively understood why is that true. Then note this, you can still go ahead and set up context even before you make this argument as to how exactly global energy crisis is going to happen, why governments and corporations react to this sort of global energy crisis, how exactly engaging in carbon heavy fuels is probably far more costly in the current status quo because of the global energy crisis that is happening. How this carbon tax then likely works, which means you're explaining how this carbon tax goes ahead and manifests, how exactly probably identify which industries or which corporations to go ahead and heavily tax and which corporations to not tax as much, and then explain why this carbon tax is significant enough to have a difference. What does this mean? It means that if you're just taxing a company for, I don't know, 5% of their revenue, I don't think it's significant enough for like the impact of, that company just shifting away from carbon heavy products to normal products or renewable products goes ahead and manifests. I think the tax needs to be significant enough for this carbon tax to go ahead and manifest at all points of time. Let's just then talk about the mechanisms of proof. Break down the logic. What does this mean? There are three mechanisms of proof in this. Number one, A carbon tax probably makes it more expensive to produce carbon rich products, thereby inflating its price, making it uneconomical for companies to go ahead and sell. So they would likely switch to lower carbon rich products. Note, this is the perspective of a corporation's decision making procedure. A corporation which is capitalistic will always try to prioritize the economical nature of its products and how its products are more accessible and affordable for their consumer base to buy. Which means, as long as you probably make it uneconomical for like for this board of directors, they're likely to just go ahead and switch to lower carbon rich products or likely switch to renewable products, whatnot, because it's probably more economical for them to do so because carbon rich products are becoming uneconomical because of based on the taxations that they go have to pay at all points of time. But the second mechanism of this argument would probably be that a carbon tax also makes it less profitable to make carbon rich products. Hence, companies need more efficient production and supply chains. Also, reliance on renewable energy increases and it's more economical in the long term. This is not, this argument might sound, or this mechanism might sound similar to the previous mechanism. It's linked, but it's not directly consistent on the decision making capacity of the corporation, but the profit making that the corporation likely goes ahead and does. Now, exactly, the company will likely be less profitable, which means the company will likely not have a greater amount of profit margins, and these profit margins which they could probably have used to go ahead and have more efficient production, or probably expand their supply chain, probably make like the reinvestment that they could have done based on the extra income that they would have had based on extended profits would probably not happen in this sort of conversation because the carbon tax makes it less profitable, which means they are likely to go for more profitable sorts of like supply chains, etc., which means they're likely to not go ahead and focus on like coal as a source of energy. They might focus on like wind energy as a source of energy or solar panels as a source of energy because it becomes more economical and more profitable for them. Their profit margins are still maintained and increased based on the renewable energy. They're likely to opt into these sort of conversations. But thirdly, a tax makes high carbon producing companies less competitive, which means likely that if you are probably a carbon company and you are probably not changing like in the worst case of sidecar, you're probably not changing regardless of the carbon tax being imposed. What does this mean? It means that when this carbon tax is probably still getting imposed, you are becoming less competitive, which means the consumer's perspective comes into play, where a consumer does not want to go ahead and buy a product from a company where the prices of the products is continually rising. Which means if you think that there is company like Maggie and there is company like there is company like Maggie and there is probably another company which sells noodles or something, and Maggie's prices are increasing drastically because Maggie probably has a supply chain which focuses on like coal and like oil, etc., and the taxations put on these sort of supply chains ensure that you probably have like more money being invested within Maggie, and for them to like maintain the profit margins, they have to increase the price of Maggie in the long term, creating more inflation in the prices of that product. As long as that inflation exists, consumers are likely to go ahead and opt into other cheaper alternatives, which means the company itself becomes less competitive in the market. They're not able to sell more, they're not able to sell better products. What does this mean? It means that lower carbon producing companies, probably companies which are more economical, which probably prioritize renewable resources and energies, because of the fact that the more amount of carbon rich things you go ahead and prioritize, the more amount of taxations you pay, right? Which means companies which probably have lower carbon emissions probably pay less taxes, which means their products are likely cheaper, get prioritized in this world, which means these lower carbon, like, which means emissions are lesser, which means the ability for companies to contribute to the global warming is lesser, which means in totality, in the long term, probably environmental protections are better, and in the short term, probably the consumer market focusing on lower carbon producing companies is probably better. This is the entire like complex argument that you can probably go ahead and run within this debate. What is the depth of proof then? There is an underlying like the underlying the mechanisms of these arguments is the depth of proof as to how these mechanisms work. Note, these mechanisms are sure, they are reasons as to why something is true, but you still need to explain how those reasons work and how those reasons manifest, which means a carbon tax probably means higher tax in sourcing, transporting and producing goods with higher carbon emissions in the global supply chain. This is the reason why the carbon tax is even significant enough for these carbon like companies or these sort of like corporations to have like higher problems on their side of the paradigm, and how exactly this is significant enough for this sort of like carbon prioritizing companies to probably not be economical enough and be uncompetitive. But secondly, when companies probably pay higher taxes, it reduces the profit margin of higher carbon products, which limits a company's ability to go ahead and fund expansions, employee retention, decreases the product output, affordability. Like the entire thing that I talked about, which means if you have lesser profitability, you probably have lesser money to go ahead and invest in your expansions and affordability, which means you probably have lesser dividends to go ahead and pay your stakeholders, etc. Which means this establishes the efficacy for carbon tax to be levied, which means companies are likely affected significantly because of this carbon tax being levied, which means there is a greater capacity for companies to probably reduce this sort of taxations, have better ability to go ahead and like engage in renewable products because it's more economical for them. This is how better economical alternatives even manifest to begin with, because you explain how one thing is so harmful for a company to go ahead and engage in that the other thing becomes the better alternative for them to go ahead and engage in. This is how depth of proof works in this sort of like mechanism that you go ahead and provide. Note something very important here. For this argument to make sense, you need to have prior context setting or a premise or an argument to go ahead and show how climate change is so bad for the people and countries and how carbon emissions from an empirical part of the same, which means you can't just go ahead and assume in this round that we are just reducing carbon emissions and it's empirically creating better outcomes for the environment. Sure, it might tangibly create better outcomes, but as long as you don't explain before this argument of carbon tax as to what the urgency metric of even implementing a carbon tax is, what the harm exactly is due to heat waves, global heat waves rising, how exactly emissions form the biggest probable pollution metric or air pollution metric in the world, it probably makes air that is hard to breathe. It probably creates far more problems for like minority populace based on the droughts that they face, based on the agriculture industries getting harmed, food supply chains getting harmed across the world, people dying due to heat waves. All of this probably establishes the vulnerability metric and how carbon emissions probably form an empirical part as to how they contribute to this sort of conversations or contribute to this sort of harm to begin with. That is an argument that you need to establish or a context that you need to establish even before you go forward with this carbon tax to begin with. So now tell me, what would be the mechanisms to go ahead and prove this argument? This argument about how exactly climate change is so bad for countries and nations. What would be the mechanisms to prove this argument? Any ideas? Hello, guys. You can unmute and say no issues, or you
Hi,
can.
hi.
Yeah,
Just give like a minute to think if that's okay.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Just drink a bit of water. So hmm. I'm just clarifying the argument. The argument would likely be how climate change is so bad for people and why
Yeah.
is emissions an empirical part. So yeah.
Um, if we go ahead and talk about the climate change part, we could just say that it probably goes and increases like the overall average temperatures, which probably would go ahead and make a lot of people, let's say, take more leaves from their work and stuff because they're not able to go ahead and cope up with the amount of heat that is produced in the environment. And because of that, if like less people are working at large or maybe opting out of more tedious work environments, you overall go ahead and reduce the amount of work that is put into a particular sector or something.
Hmm. I like to do one particular thing within this, and this is the difference between a normal argument and a complex argument. You talked about three different things within the one mechanism that you try to prove. But the thing is, you can just separate out into three mechanisms and give three different burdens of proof. What does that mean? It means increasing in temperatures probably creates far more health problems for individuals because they're facing heat strokes, etc. And that is bad on a health perspective level. That probably also means that the burden of proof of that argument would mean that people are likely spending more in healthcare. They're probably likely getting harmed more because of the environment. And that is where the harm exists. The second part would then become, or the second mechanism is people probably facing these sort of health issues would likely mean that they don't go into these sort of like workplaces, etc. Or people who are like delivery workers, etc., get disproportionately affected because of this. That is the second depth of proof or the second mechanism of the argument. You can then talk about how that affects, like under that mechanism of that argument, you can then talk about how exactly it affects like companies, corporates, the money that they can go ahead and earn, etc. Which means during heat waves and all of these problems of times, companies probably bleed more money instead of making more money to begin with, because people are more less likely to work, etc. As long as that exists, companies also have the lesser capacity to go ahead and pay off their employees, which means that there is a harm to the people who are already employed in this particular paradigm. Then probably the third manifestation of that argument would be how it affects minorities and the agricultural populace, and how exactly droughts get created, how exactly probably water supplies get mitigated. You probably do not have enough water, which means you at the end impact of that like mechanism, you likely have lesser food because you probably don't have enough water to go ahead and plant seeds, etc. Which means there is droughts, there is famines, go ahead and spread and disproportionately affect the minority populace because they already probably could not afford like food to a greater capacity, but now because of this like droughts, etc., the inflation happens in food prices, which means you're less likely to even afford the amount of food that you can go ahead and get. These are three mechanisms to prove that one argument. The difference was simple. You went from one mechanism to the other mechanism to the other mechanism and just made it one singular mechanism as to how the economy is affected. Diversify, break it down into three different mechanisms and just prove them empirically as to how that happens. Why is heat so bad? How does that cause skin cancer? How does that probably cause, like most people don't have access to sunscreens, it causes skin cancer, which means you probably have more problems for like workers who are delivery workers, etc. So all of these are probably mechanisms that you go ahead and prove. Then I talked about the depth of proof and then I talked about the end impact. Now, here is why the carbon emissions also can go ahead and have another mechanism, which is like the worsening air conditions, which means you probably have far worse health outcomes. Like another mechanism can be added to the health outcomes wala mechanism, that's just saying that, oh, you probably have like far more asthma patients, you probably have lesser quality of breathing air, which means people who probably are still wanting to go to work still can't do that because of the worsening air conditions and pollution that happens in the air sphere to begin with. And that is probably bad for the high like health populace, economics, like even agriculture to begin with, because more CO2 in the environment means a lot of plants are not getting enough oxygen and they're dying out at all points of time. You understood the difference? Hello.
Hi. Yes, understood. Thank you so much.
Yep. Huh. So let's move on to the second part of the complex argumentation, which is comprehensive counter argument, or what we need to know as flipped arguments. Flipping arguments is one of the biggest skills that you can learn in PP debating and one of the best skills that you can learn. Why? Because the skills that gets utilized in this sort of conversation is flipping the logical link, which like use the same logic to go ahead and support your side, or the same incentive or mechanism to go ahead and flip a benefit to a harm that can weigh against the other side. What does this mean? It means that if somebody has used logic A to prove argument B, then you can use that same logic A. Like suppose somebody has used the logic that prioritization of life is something which is important on our world, and that is why the argument B manifests to begin with. You can still use that logic A of prioritization of life and say how exactly, because they try to prioritize life on their world, the manifestation of that argument on their world probably deprioritizes that life, which means the principle of life or their further arguments or the mechanism of opposition probably gets flipped, their incentive probably gets flipped to go ahead and preserve life, etc. And on your world, how probably it gets better, how exactly you still preserve life on your world, etc. It's not the argument that you're trying to go ahead and flip, but it's the mechanism behind that argument, the logical linkages given in that argument that you're flipping. I'm going to explain it with an example in the next slide. But secondly, you then need to go ahead and explain the conclusions of the flip, which means if you're flipping an argument and the logic of an argument and using that for your benefit, what does it do for you within the round? How you draw impacts from that flip and what burdens you push onto the other team's code claim. See, pretty simple. A team, if they go ahead and justify enough mechanisms to prove an argument, if they give enough weighing mechanisms as to why an argument holds true, what their core claim is, and why they're likely to be prioritized, they're going to win the round. Flipping is so important within BP debating simply on the basis that if you flip a core claim on opposition's case, then that flip, then opposition has an entire burden to one, prove how probably the argument's impacts are exclusive to opposition side of the paradigm. The only benefit that opposition can get is from the exclusive to opposition side of the paradigm. Secondly, also counteract the flip and explain why that argument can't be flipped, why the logic that we use to go ahead and flip probably is not as relevant, and then go ahead and logically explain to the judge or something as to why that flip, like why your that their argument probably has even more layers of analysis or layers of benefits that can probably weigh over the flipped argument. See, one flip probably gives three layers of burden pushes on opposition. One, to cater to the flip immediately and just state why that flip is not relevant. Two, probably trying to weigh against that flip and explain on even if that flip exists, we still have other benefits that we can go ahead and provide within the round. And thirdly, still explain why their world probably does not have the harms that we talk about in the flipped argument or flipped logic to begin with. I think it might be confusing for you to understand when I'm saying this. Let's understand this with an example. The same analysis that we talked about earlier about the Gulf case as to why carbon tax is so efficient, there is a simple flip to that analysis or a tipping point analysis. If carbon tax makes it more expensive for companies to produce high carbon products, then it might prolong the transition into sustainable energy because companies have less capital to invest into the transition. This specifically harms EU and US centric industries who are already transitioning into greener tech, which means if companies don't earn enough, if companies are probably not profitable enough on site gov, then it becomes more expensive for the companies to go ahead and transition into greener tech products, just change their entire supply chain to begin with. Which means gov literally creates a counterintuitive claim where gov does not go ahead and have a benefit specifically of transitioning into greener tech because companies have lesser ability to do so. And that is exactly where the flip of or logical flip of the argument exists, which means if government is trying to have a benefit which they want to accrue, that more companies are going to opt into lower carbon tech products or lower carbon or renewable products to begin with. The avenues is not as good enough because you probably still need money to go ahead and opt into a change in supply chain, and that money government is not providing, which is simple logical flip that government does not get the benefits that they want to accrue. But secondly, and this is the flip to the second argument, which is the fact that the mechanism that I gave, that carbon rich companies become uncompetitive, so lower carbon rich companies or renewable companies become competitive in the market with lesser levels of monetary schemes and they with lesser product pricing because inflation does not happen in their world due to the carbon tax. This induced inflation and this carbon tax makes carbon companies less competitive, and this will have a counterintuitive effect of creating monopolies for existing green tech players in the market, making prices hike up with less growth and competition. Why is this true? Pretty simple. If you already have a green tech company in the market and you're inducing a carbon tax within the market, higher carbon companies sure get affected by this. They become less competitive, which means that the companies which are already having greener tech, knowing that now the demand on greener tech will likely increase, they're likely to go ahead and form monopolies to go ahead and monopolize the market and not allow newer companies or competition to pick up or manifest within the market. And these anti-competitive practices can go ahead and exist, which will probably make the prices standardized or hiked up, which will decrease competition, etc., and decrease market growth, which means innovation is also likely to decrease because of this monopolization that can go ahead and exist. This is a flipped impact onto how exactly it's not empirically good for carbon tax to be making higher carbon companies less competitive. Also, you can still go ahead and add another flip to the benefits, like the first argument that I talked about, as to how exactly people are probably getting affected at all points of time. They're probably getting affected from heat waves, etc. You can just use the harms about layoffs in developing nations for informal mining and like supply chain logistics, etc. Wait a sec. Yeah. So you can add the like layoffs in developing nations, informal mining and supply chain divisions in like third world nations. Like how exactly miners in Africa and India probably get exploited more because you probably have affected the profit margins of the company. The company still needs to make better profits, right? Which means they'll probably get exploited more and get paid less due to the lessened profit margins when the companies try to go ahead and extract as much labor as possible at the cheapest price as possible, which means the moment you invoke this carbon tax, you probably also create this sort of structural harms into developing and underdeveloped nations onto the supply chain divisions that exist within these nations. So the conclusion of this is simple. The biggest impact that Gov is trying to achieve about carbon tax forcing companies to shift to greener tech isn't manifesting, and it's creating more harms for government to deal with. You realize how this is a complex flipped argument because Gov then now has to give more nuanced analysis as to why this carbon tax probably still gives companies some level of like carbon tax will act as an incentive and not a barrier for companies to go ahead and exist into sustainable energy outcomes or shift into sustainable energy outcomes. How exactly this carbon tax will now be probably utilized, like the response from the government will probably be this carbon tax and the extra money government will likely utilize to subsidize renewable and greener tech for companies to use that as a better option and go ahead and engage in renewable tech and all of that. Will probably ensure that the more money the government is getting, they can give better employment to these people working as miners in Africa and India, and probably in like have better regulatory standards for this sort of like accountability mechanisms to get called out. For like the exploitation gets worse, and because exploitation gets worse, probably accountability mechanisms kick in, and countries can now just call out the sort of harm that is happening in developed nations to begin with. This is how you flip an argument. Now, so, in the example of carbon emission argument above, the argument that I discussed with like Rituja right now, let's understand the flip to this. What do you think will flip the logic of carbon emission linkages and will flip the impact and suffering of people? I'll give you a minute to think about. How do you flip that argument as to why people are vulnerable to carbon emissions and why carbon emissions is empirically bad or something? How do you flip that? Or the logic behind that argument? How you flip it?
About the suffering of the people, we can just like go ahead and say that there are a lot of people who probably don't have that much amount of money to just switch jobs or opt out of employment, which then means that they are like, if they go ahead and actually have to switch jobs or something, they automatically lose the financial independence or income that they had, which means carbon emissions still exist in the environment, even if it's not at the same intensity as it used to be if they were in the same work environment. So in
Yeah.
the long run, these people are anyways going to have some sort of a health issue, but then they will not have the finances to go ahead and get themselves checked or something.
Yep. So this is the flip of the impact or suffering of people. Sure. You can go ahead and do that. But what is the flip on the logic of carbon emissions? You just say that, oh, this will happen anyways, because again, people probably need transport, whatnot, and they can't go ahead and switch as immediately based on the carbon tax and all of that. All of that is true. What is the answer then to this? The answer is simple. Number one, intuitively, if you say that all carbon emissions are bad and they need to be removed or restricted, you make greener tech being built by governments, industries, NGOs more expensive, which makes it inaccessible to the normal populace. Which means then it creates the harm that Rijota talks about how a normal individual likely does not have the ability to buy a solar panel or does not have the ability to go ahead and invest in greener tech, which causes a delay in transition and a global on a global level with inflated prices, which means immediately then not just about the transitionary part about how people are affected. See, that flip already exists. That how supply chain divisions are affected, how people are affected, etc. Because it becomes more expensive for people to engage in, probably the public perception suffers as people start caring about the economical options more than climate change at all points of time because it's more proximate to an average middle class individual. That is where emissions still continue to happen because most industries in developing and underdeveloped nations still rely on fuel and coal as a source of energy and their core energy sector to begin with. They see that solar panels and EVs cost so much, so they shift to normal sources of electricity and transport that are comparatively cheaper. You literally worsen the problem instead of solving it because like renewable energy would likely be more economical on gov side, on opposition side of the paradigm, because you probably have a better ability to create renewable energy and wind farms, and probably better ability to source the materials required, or like gallium and shit required to go ahead and build the solar panels or whatnot. You worsen the problem when you increase the inflation in sourcing these mechanisms, because you increase like existing transport mechanisms still rely on fuel. You still need trucks to go ahead and transport the raw material to your factories. If you increase the fuel costs, you increase transport costs, which increase the product cost at the end of the day. You don't want to do that, which means you worsen the problem instead of solving it. I hope this cleared the like this is exactly the flip to that argument. Yeah. Yep.
Yes.
Okay. The last part of complex argumentation is the most complex thing that I can try to explain to you. If you have any questions on this particular thing after I am done explaining, please ask. True comparative emotion. What does the true comparative mean? It means that when you read a motion and the burdens of proof, a lot of experienced or even normal intermediate debaters do not go ahead and probably read the motion as closely as possible or think as to how to simplify the motion. Which means, note this: if you go ahead and have a motion that this house would like this house would implement the carbon tax, the base premise or the implicit assumption of this motion would likely be that okay, carbon tax is immediately so carbon emissions are bad, and that's why carbon tax needs to be like implemented. But the thing is, there can be a separate entire debate about monopolization and demonopolization of greener tech and how that becomes accessible, as I've already talked to you about. The flipped responses is the entire entire argument that closing opposition can go ahead and run by stating how you worsen these outcomes, how monopolization happens, how greener tech becomes inaccessible because of carbon tax existing. Note that that is a truer and more relevant comparative within the round than just stating that, oh, carbon emissions is bad, so you probably should engage in greener tech. How do you engage with a true comparative then? You think as to what mechanism can I go ahead and do to prevent this sort of monopolization? How much depth can I go ahead and increase in the sort of analysis that I'm trying to run? What is the most simplistic understanding or the most realistic implementation of a carbon tax being implemented? The moment a gov asks themselves this question, they're going to immediately realize that, oh, carbon tax probably makes higher carbon companies less competitive, which means lower carbon companies probably become more get more leeway into the market. They can probably create more monopolizations. How do I prevent this monopolization? Probably I don't go ahead and directly I can probably go ahead and prioritize the antitrust regulation that's already going to exist in this world and apply it to the sort of monopolized markets. Or secondly, regardless of the fact that monopolization happens, I still don't allow the standardization of prices to be resting on private actors. I can still try to subsidize renewable energy for normal people. I can still subsidize renewable energy for corporates to engage in based on the increased income that the government has due to this carbon tax, and allow for better transitionary capacity that the government can establish, which directly takes and contests with the closing opposition's flip and argument about how exactly this sort of thing manifests to begin with, and how exactly this sort of like harms can go ahead and manifest. If you like, it's the debate is not just about one harm getting solved by one taxation or one deterrence mechanism, but also why the alternative is becoming more proximate to people. Both these paradigms being engaged perfectly will ensure that you probably have a very holistic and really good case that is very hard to take down at all points of time. This is what the true comparative of debates look like, which means some arguments legitimately start further from the main starting point from the round, which means if you go ahead and try to run this just simplistic argumentation as to how this likely manifests, I already told you how the ability for like corporates to probably go ahead and engage in the renewable sector probably becomes problematic, which means this comparative as to how it's bad and you need to solve it probably starts further from the main point of the round, which is why is renewable energy accessible and how exactly will this implementation happen and why exactly will this implementation be good to begin with. That is where the true comparative of the debate lies, and comparative and true comparative probably tackles that gap in understanding, which is logically prior analysis. I have an example to prove this. In a motion which is termed as this house would implement automation tax, the base assumption of this motion is that if you place a tax on corporations who automate more, the base assumption of this motion, what does this motion do? Is the fact that you probably place a tax on corporations automate more. Gov in this motion can easily make a case about how automation is bad due to the layoffs it creates. So this tax reduces automation and lets the labor market go ahead and catch up. Guff like can go ahead and make this entire case that how probably this automation probably reduces like the layoffs, and because it layoffs become uneconomical for people to engage with, because automation itself becomes more expensive for companies to engage with, which means labor market can still go ahead and catch up, labor market can still upskill and ensure that this automation is something which is not drastic enough for huge amounts of layoffs to happen. But then there is a better comparative for Guff to debate on, and that comparative is that the automation of an like, implementation of an automation tax directly translate into monopolies or bigger player dominance in the market, simply because of the fact that SMEs and smaller startups cannot go ahead and cater to this extended level of automation, which means so extended level of taxation on automation, which means more SMEs are less likely to go ahead and automate their processes, or SMEs are not even likely to come up in automation heavy environments, which means that SMEs probably do not have the capacity to automate. They become uncompetitive compared to more competitive bigger players who can just handle the brunt of this automation tax and still continue their greater levels of automation to begin with. Then the debate would become that why the state induced monopolies are good and how they will still go ahead and support the growth within the state. How do you likely go ahead and prove that? Simply on the basis that if state is earning more from automation tax, they can use that extended amount of earnings to go ahead and subsidize or probably even fund better startups who probably go fund better startups or probably provide better employment or increase the like avenue of employment and employment benefits to labor markets, etc. Normal people who go ahead and engage within this sort of like startups to begin with. They probably try to have public-private partnerships with these monopolies, and these public-private partnerships ensure that these monopolies as well hire more and more people. They can expand more and more into labor markets, etc. They don't have to fully automate; they can partially automate and have a partial like service-based marketing mechanism, and that is where they can probably have better comparative for Gov to have this sort of like implementation to begin with. That is a better and truer comparative, because you are not just debating on a lower burden, a smaller idea about how, like simplistic analysis you're not just providing, which can easily be rebutted by opposition's complex analysis to how this creates more monopolies and more like lesser competition in the market, which probably creates far more harms for the government as to how the automation can now probably still happen, just that smaller players probably do not give more jobs to normal people. So if you're an OG and you just run the first case that I talked about as to how automation is bad due to layoffs, and that is why you probably implement an automation tax, any smart closing opposition can just weigh the fact out that you probably do not create more jobs, you probably create monopolies in the market, and these monopolies are empirically bad, and closing opposition can win the debate. Truer comparatives enable you better engagement within the round and enable you to go ahead and way better within the round and probably build better and more cohesive cases that can go ahead and enable you to get a first from like any house within the round. As long as you go ahead and understand what the nuanced implementation of a particular policy or mechanism or like pitfall of an argument is, you can mitigate that and you can weigh that out, as long as you go ahead and give like good and better comparatives and engage holistically in the round. This is a comparative which deals with the mechanism of implementation and realistic outcomes of the same without jumping into the direct conclusion of lesser automation and more like labor market suffrage to begin with. There is another example on burdens then. The burden is simple. In a debate about this house believes that people should be given a right to die, Goff can run a very simple case as to how people are pained and they should be given the ability to relieve themselves from this pain, and that is why the right to die needs to exist. But a deeper, truer comparative would be who controls the decision of a person who chooses to live and die, like family, governments, etc., and why this person like this person should have the liberty to make their decision about their own life, which means Goff can still run the analysis as to how government should not have the ability to dictate what a person chooses to live or die to begin with, and families also should probably not have the ability to choose and dictate whether the choose and dictate or affect the individual autonomy of a person to choose to live or die to begin with. You can just use an intuitive analysis by saying that a person probably becomes more proximate to death when they do not have enough family support, and their family probably does not love them enough, or their family is one of the causes of oppression, one of the causes that they're probably doing a degree they don't like, a job job that they don't like, their life has become a living hell, and they want to go ahead and die at all points of time. Which means this family then cannot go ahead and prolong the suffering of this individual, and cannot go ahead and say that they cannot go ahead and use the analysis or just have any sort of coercion onto the autonomy of this individual to go ahead and choose to die at all points of time. This is a truer burden, which means as long as OJ tries to prove this burden to begin with, there is lesser ability for CG to even enter this debate and prove something new or novel within the round. And OJ can still contest opposition's arguments as to why a government should less likely be able to go ahead and want their populace to die to begin with. Any OJ can still outframe CEO's analysis on pain and pain and why exactly the government should probably not allow people to kill themselves by giving an analysis as to how the state is probably directly responsible as well for people to go ahead and do so, because state is probably directly responsible for human people being facing pain and suffering etc in this world, not getting enough employment, living dead lives, and because of this moral culpability of the state cannot dictate somebody's ability to choose to live or die to begin with, because the state is directly responsible for a harm, or perpetrator cannot also increase the amount of harm that is happening on a person or prolong that harm on that person to begin with. It is cruel for them for the state to do so. This is where the session ends. So this is the entire session on argumentation and extensions. Any questions up until now? Any clarifications? Anything you want to ask? Please do so.
I have a question. It's probably not related to this, but like, if I'm
Yep.
the closing house and then the opening sees a particular argument,
Mhm.
like let's say if I'm the opening opposition says a particular argument, and the entirety of even closing government or opening government's case is based a lot on what happens if that particular argument is like does not exist or the opposite exists. Basically, taking out opening opposition's entire
Mhm.
argument. Me as a closing, until and unless if I have to win over other houses, I will have to go ahead and probably rebut or at least like do something. In certain situations I might have to go ahead and like knife my own openings argument because I don't really have any other option.
No. See, firstly, what is knifing? What does knifing mean? Knifing means that you're openly rebutting your opening's argument and you're stating that, opening opposition's case or whatever, that is probably fully beating opening's argument, and openings has these problems in their argument. No. How are you supposed to go about this? You're supposed to say that we cater to the harm that opening opposition is pushing better by giving an exclusive a solvency metric within your debate. What does this mean? It means that if opening opposition has pushed something that opening government takes out opening government's entire case, you point that out to the judge. You say that opening government's case probably does not become as much persuasive on the basis that opening oppositions, or on the basis of the debate, assuming that opening opposition this harm does not manifest. We are going to prove from CG how this harm does not manifest in closing government's model, and why exactly we solve this harm exclusively or even flip this harm onto opposition side of the paradigm to ensure that we take a first even above our own opening. Simple implicit way. You don't even have to knife your own opening to do that. You can see there are things that you use in building up of arguments. There are natures in which institutions work, people work, capitalism work, etc. All of these things are setups from either side of the world. Opening cannot skew this setup, which means if you use these same setups to go ahead and prove and give more reasons as to why opening opposition's argument is less persuasive, you are going to be more persuasive than your opening's own opening, because your own opening never catered to opening opposition's argument manifesting.
Okay.
You can rebut and flip. See, even if you rebut, rebuttals need to be on a comparative basis. Why exactly that rebutting that you're doing probably gets better on your world, because debates are largely measured on the contributions that you go ahead and have. Even if you rebut opening opposition's argument, but you don't go ahead and prove why your world is better from CG, there is a lesser likelihood of you to be benefiting from that sort of conversation. Yep.
Okay, okay. Thank you.
No worries. Huh. Okay. So assuming no questions, I'll just then stop sharing this. Yeah, I'll probably just share the PPT as well later on to people from KODC and the circuit as well, so that they can use this PPT as much as they want. And yep, this is where my session ends. Hope you liked it. Sure.